Hello and welcome to the Crisis Point podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Before I get started, just remind you to like and subscribe to the channel, to this podcast in particular. Rate it on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. Is iTunes even? They didn't call it iTunes anymore. I think they call it like Apple Podcasts, whatever. Anyway, spread the word, let people know about it, and I'd really appreciate it. Okay, so today I want to talk about what I call the post-COVID Catholic Church. Now, first of all, I just want to be clear. I know we're not really past COVID. I know we're still dealing with it. I just mean the world after COVID began. The church as it is after COVID, as opposed to the way the church was before COVID. And so there's this podcast is based upon surveys that were done by the Pillar Catholic, and I've linked to them in the show notes. You can check them out so you can kind of understand that. I'm not going to display all these graphs on the screen or anything like that, because people listen to this as well. They wouldn't be able to see it anyway. But I encourage you to go look at those reports over at the Pillar. Basically, what they did was they tried to get they did a pretty comprehensive survey of the state of religion in America, but also the Catholic Church in particular. And I had some takeaways from that that I think we'd be interested in looking at. Now, one thing I do want to say is I've been studying the numbers of, when it comes to the Catholic Church, membership, practice, people going to mass, baptism, things like that, for over a decade now. I was the director of evangelization for a diocese for 5 years. That was, and I started that over 10 years ago. And I was very involved, and I very much am a numbers guy. I like looking at the numbers and trying to see, okay, what does it tell us? Because that should adapt what we do and what we say. If certain things are working, we go with that. If they're not working, we don't go with that. That being said, I don't want it to also sound like we're just a numbers game. The Catholic Church is about evangelizing the world with the truth of Jesus Christ. And there will be times and places where that truth is rejected. And so we're not just trying to do a sales technique. What is it that brings the most people in? But I do think we should say that, especially in modern times, as the church has really tried to adapt to the modern world, we should ask ourselves, if we're making these changes in order to attract people, but people aren't actually attracted, maybe we should reconsider how we present things and how we practice our faith. So first, I just want to have a quick overview of before COVID. So before February, March 2020, what was the situation in the Catholic Church in America? And I am focused only on America here. That's what the surveys are from. I think the situation is similar in some other developed Western countries like Canada, the UK, Western Europe, Australia, but I don't claim to be an expert on that. And also, I'm not at all making any claims about the Catholic Church in Africa, for example, or Asia. This is simply the Catholic Church in the United States of America. So what was the situation before COVID hit? It was terrible. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I've written articles at Crisis about this. You can see the stats from the Pillar surveys. CARA, the Catholic Apostolate of Research, or something, I can't remember, out of Georgetown, CARA, has a lot of stats on this. This is where I've always gotten most of my statistics in the past. It was terrible. And just one way you can measure it, I think one of the best ways is to measure Catholic baptisms, particularly of kids, because if the Catholic Church is growing, then you're going to have more people baptizing their kids. You're going to have more converts that are going to then have their kids baptized. And that's just and also you're going to have a growing church in the sense that the Catholics are having kids. And so that's the sign of a healthy church to me. There's different ways you can measure it, but I personally think one of the best ways to measure a healthy church is the number of baptisms, infant baptisms in particular. Well, if you look at the numbers in the Catholic Church, in 1965, 33% of all American children born received Catholic baptisms. So 1 out of every 3 kids that were born in 1965 in America received a Catholic baptism. In 2019, so before COVID, that number was 15%. Only 15% of children born in America in 2019 received a Catholic baptism. So the numbers have just plummeted greatly. And I've noticed a trend I noticed was that there was a big drop from around the late 60s to about the mid 70s. And I think we all can have different opinions of what that is, why that happened in different Catholic numbers. Big drop, mass attendance, baptisms, what have you, from the late 60s, 1970 or so until about 1975. But then honestly, around 1975 or between 1975 and 1980, we see a leveling off where the numbers stay very static until about the year 2000. Now, when I say it's static, what I mean is the raw numbers are static because the population of America during that time was increasing greatly. And so technically it was actually going down as a percentage. But in general, the numbers stayed pretty steady. But then in the year starting around the year 2000, the numbers just plummet. And the same is true about these numbers about babies baptized. It stayed about steady from about 1975 to 2000, and then it just drops like a rock starting around the year 2000. And I think we have, I've speculated on a lot of things, but a lot of times we point the finger at Catholic events, like for example, the abuse crisis that came out in 2002 and various things of that nature. I do think one thing we should note, though, is that religious affiliation, religious practice in general in America has plummeted since the year 2000. It's not just Catholics. And so we can't say it's all just a Catholic problem. Clearly, the Catholic Church is not doing anything better than anybody else. It's not doing anything to arrest that slide, but it is happening. And so and so even before COVID, what we saw was that the numbers weren't great from the 70s to 2000. They were staying static when the country was growing, but since 2000, it's been a precipitous decline. It's been just really, every number is terrible when we look at it. There's really no exceptions to those numbers as far as mass attendance, attendance at confession, going to considering yourself Catholic, baptisms, all of that. So now let's look at the case with COVID, that all of a sudden now we have a situation where life as we know it changed, and particularly parish life has changed considerably as well. And so let me find the numbers. I apologize. There's a lot of different numbers here. Okay, so the pillar, basically what it showed was that the number of people who attend Mass weekly has decreased by 14% since COVID. Now, there's two things I want to note about that. First is they actually count people who attend Mass streaming, which I think is a problematic way to do it. I don't consider watching a streaming Mass as being attending Mass. We can debate that. I get that. But the point is that even including those who stream, the number of people who attend Mass weekly has dropped by 14%. Now, 14% may or may not sound like a big deal to you, but we're talking about 14% in less than 2 years. That's huge. That is a huge drop of people. If you lost 14% each year, pretty soon you're gone. And so that's a major drop. Also, the number of Catholics who never go to Mass now has increased by 62%. 62% of people who went to Mass at least somewhat, I guess, before COVID, they never go. Or I guess that's all Catholics. And so what we see is a huge decrease in the number of people who are attending Mass after COVID. And so, again, 14%. So to put that in perspective, if you have a parish of 100 people before COVID who are at Mass each week, 100, now you have 86 there. And that's a considerable drop. Now, I want to compare that. Now, Pillar didn't do this, but I just want to mention that the crisis, I should have put this in the show notes, and I will later. Crisis, we did a survey in the summer, last 2021, so last July, of traditional Latin Mass parishes. Basically, we reached out to every traditional Latin Mass parish we could find an email address for, which is most of them in America. And we simply asked them what their attendance was at various times over the past few years. And essentially, the average attendance at a traditional Latin Mass in America was 163 people. This is in January 2020, so right before COVID, 163. In June of 2021, it was 196. That is an increase of 20%. So I use the example of if you in a regular parish, you had 100 people, now it's 86 post-COVID. If it's a traditional Latin Mass parish, it went from 100 to 120. And so you see there's this huge divergence happening between the regular parishes and traditional Latin Mass parishes. Now, the question becomes, why is this? And I know people are very opinionated about this, and I am too. But I have the podcast, so I'll say my opinion. I think there's a lot of factors to consider. I take most of my opinions based upon, first of all, the raw data. The fact is that more people attend the Latin Mass than they did before COVID in America. That is an indisputable fact from surveys, anecdotal evidence, whatever. You will not, there's no way you can argue that there are less people or the same number of people going to traditional Latin Mass now that there were before COVID. It just simply is a fact. It's a fact that more people are going. So the question, and it's also seems to be a fact that less people are going to most Catholic parishes on average. So then we have to ask ourselves why that is. And so like I said, my opinion is based upon the numbers, but also on anecdotal evidence, plus like just talking to people. I obviously talk to a lot of people at my own parish, and I go to a traditional Latin Mass myself. And I talk to a lot of people around the country. A lot of people send me emails, tell me things about what's going on in their neck of the woods. What I think I've seen is that most of the people who started going to traditional Latin Mass post-COVID didn't go because of traditional Latin Mass. Now, traditional Latin Mass was growing before COVID. In fact, let me just note that from 2019, I'm going to do some math on the fly during a podcast. First time ever. Let's see if I can handle this or not. 63 minus 145. I feel like an accountant. This is exciting podcast stuff right here. 18 divided by 1. Okay, so the year before COVID, the traditional Latin Mass was growing by 12%. Post-COVID, it grew by 20%. So it was already growing before COVID. And so obviously the people who went to it before COVID probably were going solely because of this traditional Latin Mass. They'd heard about it. Maybe their friend invited them, whatever the case may be. But post-COVID, I do think a lot of people, that bump we had of people starting to go, is what we saw was that people went because of the COVID restrictions. In general, and this is anecdotal, I admit, but I've heard it far and wide. In general, most traditional Latin Mass parishes had less restrictions at their parishes due to COVID. They weren't as strict with mask mandates. They weren't as strict with social distancing, things of that nature. They didn't really push people so hard. And so that is something that is just, I think we've seen that. So what happened was people who did not like those restrictions, they didn't like being told every single week, "Where's your mask?" Here's the server. The person at the door forcing their sanitizer on them, gloves, and all the craziness. Maybe not allowing communion on the tongue. All those crazy things. And so I think that basically what we have is a lot of people did start going to traditional Latin Mass recently because of the COVID restrictions. Now, I think, though, what I've also seen is a lot of the people who started going because of that, they continued. Now they think that now they're there for the traditional Latin Mass. I joke that they came for the masks and they stay for the Mass. So they came because we didn't require masks. And I say I just mean most traditional Latin Mass parishes. But they stay because they fell in love with the Mass. I know of a number of people who never went to a traditional Latin Mass before COVID. Now they go regularly and they're like, "I'm not going anywhere else. This is my home. I can't believe I didn't know about this before." And now they're going. And so I don't think it's just a temporary thing. For example, because I know a number of parishes, regular parishes, have stopped with the restrictions or at least loosened them some, and people didn't go back. They kept going to the traditional Latin Mass parish. So I think we see there again a situation where that I think people are going to continue to go to the traditional Latin Mass parishes. COVID might have caused it, but that's not the only reason why they stayed. Now, here's the thing. Why is it, though, that traditional Latin Mass parishes had less restrictions? I think we should ask ourselves that. Why did that happen? And why was that attractive to certain people who then fell in love with the traditional Latin Mass? Why did certain people decide not to go to not go to their parish because of the restrictions? And I think, honestly, it has to do with a faithfulness to the fact that our spirit is more important than our body, that our spiritual needs are greater than our bodily needs. And what a lot of people saw at their regular parish, it revealed to them that maybe there wasn't a strong foundation of faith. And by the way, let me make an aside here. I think this is probably true of people started attending maybe more faithful Novus Ordo parishes that did not have all the restrictions as well. I just think it happens to be true that most of the traditional Latin Mass parishes were the ones that didn't have all the restrictions. And so essentially what we're seeing, though, is that people were like, they badgered me so much. They didn't seem to want me there. They didn't want my family there. And the families that are doing this, I noticed that there are these big families that are faithful. They already were Orthodox Catholics before they started going to traditional Latin Mass. They're already faithful to the church before this. They usually had a lot of kids. They were involved in their parishes. And all of a sudden their parishes tell them, no, you cannot enter this building unless you mask up, unless you do all these things. We're not going to let you receive communion on the tongue, things like that. And they said, we don't want you here anymore. But the traditional Latin Mass parishes didn't do that. They said, no, we understand that the spirit is more important than the body. And so we are going to welcome you here, even if you don't wear a mask. We're not so afraid of this virus that we're going to turn people away from the sacraments because of it. We're going to accept people, and we're going to put the sacrament as the most important thing. An example of this is I just today saw a parish bulletin, and it's not even in my diocese, and I won't say where it is, a parish bulletin where the person, the pastor's message was, and this was just from this week, it was a recent one. It was completely focused on the need to wear masks and be safe, and saying how great the parish is doing wearing masks, and we got to continue to do this, all that. And I also noticed, though, that confession was only available by appointment at this parish. They had no regularly scheduled time. We all know what by appointment means. We know it means we don't, that they don't really have it. Nobody goes. And so there's a perfect example of you have a parish that's completely focused on this virus and not at all focused on spiritual needs of their people. I mean, they're not even offering confession regularly, yet they're badgering them about wearing masks and staying safe and all those things. So I think these things reveal to the world the priorities of the parish. And so faithful Catholics are saying, this is ridiculous. These people are putting this virus above, and safety, physical safety, above our spiritual needs and for the sacraments. And so they're leaving from that. And I think this is also backed by the some of the data from the Pillar, some related data from the Pillar surveys. They ask why Catholics stopped going to church. Now, this was not COVID. This is just completely, so people who might have left 10 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever the case may be. Why did they stop going to church? The number one reason, it wasn't, the church doesn't ordain women, the church is against abortion or anything like that. It was, I moved away from the church I had been attending. That's 20% of people, Catholics who stopped going to church. That's why. They just moved. The second biggest reason was I did not feel that attending church mattered. The third biggest reason is I moved away from my family. Again, they just moved away. Or I had the next one. I had a change in circumstances such as work, health, family situation that made it harder to attend. Notice those first three of the four, and really all four of them, there weren't some major theological reasons they stopped going. They just simply either moved away or they weren't really attached to their parish anymore. And so what we see is that people develop an attachment to their parish, not to the Catholic Church. And so if something happens to harm that relationship they have with their parish, they're very likely going to leave. So for example, if somebody moves, if they live in Ohio and they move to Florida, there's a good chance they don't find a parish, because for a lot of Catholics, that is their Catholic Church. They don't think in terms of the global Catholic Church. They think in terms of their Catholic Church, i.e. the one down the street from them. And so what we see with these numbers of people who are stopping to go to the regular parishes because of COVID, I think it makes sense. Because if all of a sudden your whole experience of the Catholic Church is your parish, and now your parish makes you feel very unwelcome if you don't do the COVID dance, song and dance of masking and everything else. And now they're in some places they're saying you have to be vaccinated even to attend, like up in Canada. Well, then there's a very good chance you're going to break that person's relationship with the Catholic Church. And the ones who have a stronger faith, like their faith is beyond just their parish, they end up finding the parish nearby that is going to welcome them and is going to faithfully transmit the teaching of the church, which in most cases has been the traditional Latin Mass parish. Like I said, there are exceptions. There are some good, faithful Novus Ordo parishes out there, but as a rule, it's been the traditional Latin Mass parishes. And so I think that's why people are going. So what we see is, first of all, the importance of a parish, being a place where the faith is lived out, because if it's not, then people will just stop going. And also, I think it's important that we teach the faithful that the Catholic Church is more than your parish. Might be paradoxical from what I said before, but because if they move, we don't want them to stop going to Mass just because they moved. Or even in this case, like for example, if it starts being difficult to go to your parish because the pastor starts implementing some stupid rules, we don't want them to leave the Catholic Church altogether. So fortunately, some have found the traditional Latin Mass, the good parishes, but a lot have left altogether. And so we want to prevent that from happening. And so what I think we see is overall from a macro perspective, what do we see for the future? I mentioned that let's talk about the future. That's where we are now. What do we see for the future? I mean, I think all numbers point to a massive decline in the Catholic Church in America. I just don't know how you can say otherwise based upon everything we've seen. Obviously, God can work his miracles, and we pray that he will. And then all of a sudden we'll have a massive conversion to the Catholic faith here in America. I mean, I pray for that all the time. But realistically, that's not how God usually works. He usually leaves us. I mean, he pray, and we pray to him and he gives us our graces. But if we're not faithful to him, he doesn't magically make everything just snap. It's all of a sudden better. And all the numbers show that the Catholic Church is in a massive decline. And I think there's no reason to think that won't continue. And I think COVID simply accelerated that. It's my prediction that in 10 years, in 2030, we will see at least a 50% drop in attendance from what we have right now. I think COVID accelerated that. So maybe it would even be worse, or maybe it will be sooner. But I just think we're seeing a massive decline. We see one bright spot in those numbers. We see one bright spot, and that's traditional Latin Mass parishes. And you could argue it's because of the traditional Latin Mass. You could argue it's because COVID has basically, the COVID restrictions, they haven't been doing them as much. So therefore, people are seeing it for that reason. Wherever the case may be, the numbers show, the surveys show that people are leaving regular Catholic parishes, and mostly just leaving the Catholic Church totally. But some are going to the traditional Latin Mass. And some people outside the church go to traditional Latin Mass. My parish has a number of, has our largest adult conversion class it's had in years. And so I think some of that, some people are coming from outside the church as well. But again, we see this massive decline. And I don't want to be depressing or anything like that. I think we can pray and we can work. But I think what we should do is recognize where it is that the church does have a bright spot. And we should do all we can to promote that. Whether or not you're a traditional Latin Mass goer or not, I mean, you should be supportive of the traditional Latin Mass if you're a faithful Catholic, because why wouldn't you be? If it's bringing people to Jesus Christ, if it's bringing people to the church, or it's at least keeping them from leaving, that's a good thing, right? That's something we should support. And I know there are people on very highest levels of the church that aren't supportive of that. But at the same time, that's the type of thing that I think all Catholics who care about the future of the Catholic Church should be at least supportive of. Now, I want to address, we had one of the commenters in the chat, in the live chat here on YouTube, had made some questions here. And one of them, I'll put it up on the screen. It says, other than your surveys of some traditional parishes, what basis do you have to think traditional communities are going to grow and be the future of the American church? I think I answered that already. I wouldn't say the future of the American church in the sense of, and this is something I want to be very clear about. I'm not saying, I want to be clear. I think the Catholic Church will change and will become, and the traditional traditional Latin Mass parishes will become more predominant, assuming that they're not crushed by the Vatican, more because all the other parishes are going to decline a ton. And I just think that's, the numbers show that. I mean, that's pretty much the numbers don't lie about that. So I think I've answered that already. Also, it says, what authority do you claim to have any guidance on this subject? None whatsoever. I'm just looking at the numbers like anybody else. Anybody can look at them. Anybody can come to their conclusions. I'm a dude with a webcam. And so that's all, that's my authority. That's all my authority is. I make no claims otherwise. Of course, when it comes to making predictions of the future, guess what? Nobody has authority, and none of us are prophets, unless you're a prophet. If you're a prophet, okay, God bless you. I'm not a prophet, but nobody else has ability to predict the future perfectly. I'm just making what I think are educated guesses. I think they are educated based upon the numbers and what I've seen. So I think here's my takeaway from all this is that the situation is dire. Let's not pretend it isn't. That's one of my biggest frustrations at a lot of dioceses and parishes. They act like things are just hunky-dory. One of the things I was very happy about my own diocese of Cincinnati is that the bishop clearly recognizes that the situation is dire. That's why he's trying to make massive changes to parishes and having less parishes, more priests his priests at fewer parishes. I think that's just what has to be done. So kudos to him for doing that. But I do think a lot of dioceses, a lot of parishes act like everything's fine. I mean, you look at these parish bulletins, you look at, the announcements from the diocese, it's like everything is just, there's nothing wrong going on. So the situation is dire. So I think what we do as Catholics is we cling to, first of all, the truth. We cling to the faith as it's been handed on to us from our predecessors in the faith. And we do look at what's working. And we try to adapt that. Even if you don't want to say make every parish a traditional Latin Mass parish, fine. But at least see, okay, what did they do that's attracting people? Maybe we should do some of that. Like, for example, don't make fear of a virus more important than the sacraments, more important than the spiritual needs of your people. Don't do that. That's the number one thing I would say is the takeaway from all this. If you are work at a parish, if you're a pastor at a parish, don't put your fear or even your parishioners' fear of this virus above the reality that we have spiritual needs and you're there to fulfill them. So that's the first thing. Second is maybe the actual fact that a lot of people who end up coming to the traditional Latin Mass end up loving it and don't want to leave it. That should tell you something too, that maybe the way Mass is celebrated, the liturgy is celebrated in your parish just isn't that great, isn't conducive to people staying with the faith. Maybe the fact that at traditional Latin Mass parishes, you have a higher rate of confessions available. Maybe that's another factor that people see like, oh my goodness, we need to make confession more available to our people. I think that's another thing we have to see. All those things I do think will help parishes become stronger. And yes, people will still continue to leave. Our culture is rotted, but I do think it will not accelerate that decline like I think the COVID response has done. So that's my takeaway. Everybody has might have different opinions about this, but I encourage you to look at the numbers. I've already put in the show notes the pillar surveys. I'll put the crisis survey about the traditional Latin Mass in there as well after I get finished here. But just let's pray for the church. Let's all of us pray for those who are, who have left the church, those who are leaving the church, those who aren't coming back. We need to pray for them fervently and do all we can to bring them back and to bring people into the Catholic Church. That's our duty. That's what our Lord has told us to do. So let's make sure we do that. Okay, so until next time, God love you.